It's me, Bo, back once again with another cult movie review here on the Film Scene Investigation channel. Hope everyone is doing good. In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing the controversial French film Baise-Moi. So, Baise-Moi from the year 2000 was this independently made low-budget film set in France. Starring Karen Bach and Raffaella Anderson, the two actresses had previously worked in the porn industry before being cast. Going into this film, I had no idea that these two actresses were adult performers. So, knowing that they were involved in this type of production definitely added a layer of intrigue. When it comes to the story, we followed Nadine and Manu, two women living their separate lives in Bordeaux. Nadine, who was played by Karen Bach, was a prostitute who was living with a very stressful roommate. We saw her and her roommate constantly clash over the smallest things. Nadine didn't really like her job as a prostitute, but in some ways it was her way of escaping the drama that her roommate created. Separately to all of this, we met Manu, who was played by actress Raffaella Anderson. Manu was a person who seemed to be involved with all the wrong people, but yet she came across as someone that could handle herself. Anderson definitely brought some intensity to her role, which clearly showed on screen. Soon enough, we saw Manu and one of her friends get abducted by three thugs who drove them to a warehouse and sexually assaulted them. While her friend screamed out in horror, Manu seemed to detach herself from the whole ordeal. And surprisingly, once the whole sexual assault was over, Manu acted like it wasn't a big deal and just seemed to want to move on. It was a very strange reaction to having been sexually assaulted, but at the time I kind of thought that maybe this was some sort of delayed response to the attack. So after that horrific sequence of events, the next day we saw Manu visit her brother at his apartment. Very quickly, her brother noticed Manu's bruising and pressed her for information about how she got these bruises. But Manu didn't want to talk about it. She kind of just closed herself off from the whole thing and, pretended like nothing happened, which only infuriated her brother. Manu's silence only made things worse. But then again, I could understand why she wouldn't want to discuss it, especially with a family member. An argument then broke out between the two siblings, which resulted in Manu shockingly shooting her brother point blank with his own gun. It was a sudden burst of gunfire, and then he was dead. And if this wasn't kind of crazy enough, the film then suddenly cut back to Nadine, who was having a fight with her roommate. Nadine had pinned down her roommate and literally choked her to death. Another kind of random moment of madness that I didn't see coming. I gathered that the two weren't best friends. They clearly didn't get on, but I never expected Nadine to go so far as to commit murder in cold blood. So two brutal murders occurring at the exact same time. Surprisingly though, both women never seemed to hold any guilt over their actions. There was no regret or even remorse felt by either one of them. Now it's important to remember at this point in the film, Manu and Nadine were two strangers. They never knew each other. But quickly after the two murders, they soon met outside a train station. They had this very brief discussion, which then led them to both drive to Paris in Manu's car. From there, the two bonded and began killing random people that they came across. As the bodies started piling up, the French authorities were increasingly concerned about what was going on. Clearly, this pair were a danger to society, and it wasn't long before the girls were on the run from the French police. Time would start to run out for the pair, but it was clear that Manu and Nadine were never going to give up. They made a pact to survive as long as possible. Now, let's take a moment to discuss the sexual assault scene involving Manu and her friend. Now, this was a very graphic scene that wasn't easy to watch. I do give credit to the filmmakers for depicting this horrific sequence in such a realistic way. I mean, 1 minute Manu and a friend were drinking a beer and hanging out. The next, they were being manhandled by some thugs in this warehouse. I mean, it was such a sudden turn of events that I didn't see coming. Even when the camera was focused on Manu, you could hear the friend screaming out in terror in the background. Just a very shocking scene that, was not easy to sit through. Also, I have to mention that specific bird's eye view that we got as the assault unfolded. The camera was positioned atop of the warehouse, tilted over a railing. Using that specific camera angle gave me the impression that, I don't know, it was like there was a stranger that was watching from above. Obviously, it was just the three men and the two women, but having that perspective really added a sense of realism to the whole ordeal. I think viewing the assault from that vantage point definitely blurred the lines between what was real and what wasn't. You know, I think it would be fair to say that this movie definitely presents men in a very negative light. I mean, all of the men that we saw in this movie were presented as either weirdos or jerks who belittled and disrespected women. It was a very harsh and almost over-the-top portrayal of adult French males. This all led me to do some research on Coralie Trenti and Virginie Despentes, the women behind Baise-Moi. I guess I wanted to try and understand where the director's viewpoint of men came from. And well, to my surprise, the writer and director Virginie Despentes had actually been sexually assaulted when she was younger. I mean, once I read that, everything made sense as to why the film carried such a spiteful interpretation of men. Despentes had used her personal experience, her personal trauma, and created this fictional story about two women going on a killing spree. Because the movie leaned into Despentes' real-life trauma, in some ways this is kind of like a biopic of sorts. And maybe, just maybe, Despentes writing this script may have been a therapeutic way for her to overcome this trauma. The way I see it, it was a case of a creator living their voyeuristic pleasures through the characters that they created. When it comes to the actual performances in the film, I thought that both Karen Buck and Raffaella Anderson did pretty good jobs. I mean, there's no denying that these two had some great chemistry together. which of course was essential for this movie to work. Like I mentioned earlier, the key thing to remember here was that both actresses were former adult performers, which gave the film this unique twist. Casting a pair of adult performers, it was a very unusual casting decision, but I guess in some ways it made sense given the film's strong sexual themes. I did appreciate the filmmakers for stepping outside the box when it came to the casting choices. So while the performances were okay, I did think that Rafaela Anderson had a little more star appeal to her persona. There was a certain presence that Anderson brought to her role, and out of the two, I could have imagined Anderson going on to star in other projects, but it didn't happen. On a side note, there was some crazy foreshadowing going on in this film. So we saw during the end sequence of the film, Manu get killed in a failed robbery attempt. Manu was dead and Nadine was in complete shock and confused about what to do next. She was broken, she was bruised, and she eventually started to contemplate suicide. She would go so far as to actually hold a gun close to her head, ready to pull the trigger just before she was apprehended by the police. Now, what makes this thing so tragic is that in reality, the actress playing Nadine, Karen Bach, actually committed suicide a few years later. Now, I believe the cause of death was an overdose and not a bullet to the head. But still, knowing that the actress died in that way and seeing her then contemplate that in the movie, just very creepy foreshadowing. Now, before we get to dislikes, I have to mention the film's aesthetic here for a moment. It had this gritty, independent, low-budget vibe which completely matched the strong subject matter. Baise-Moi was filmed on digital cameras, not the typical film format. With that, it resulted in the film looking more like a documentary at times, rather than your standard French indie movie. The combined low-quality camera work mixed in with the industrial punk soundtrack was a great combination, and it really heightened the film's realism. And so, dislikes for Baise-Moi from the year 2000. My biggest dislike for the film would have to be its pacing. Now, this wasn't a long movie. In fact, I believe it was only 77 minutes, but even so, there were some aspects of the film that seemed rushed. For example, when Nadine and Manu first met outside the train station, within a minute they were driving off to Paris on this road trip. I mean, there was no build-up really, there was no time for that scene to really breathe. It was 1 minute they bump into each other, the next they're best friends on a killing spree. I mean, these two women were the central characters, and I just thought that them meeting would be a pivotal moment in the story, but it was treated like an afterthought. It was like it was some throwaway scene that didn't mean anything. I don't know. It just seemed so rushed and underdeveloped. Also, I thought that there was way too much time spent on the various sex scenes in the film. As I mentioned, this was not a long film, yet time was wasted on lingering sexual content, and ultimately the story suffered for it. And that's why I found it hard to believe that Nadine and Manu would become so close in such a short amount of time. I mean, an extra 10 minutes would have easily improved the film's overall quality. I mean, when it comes to the directors, they weren't necessarily very experienced, so I don't want to be too critical because overall I thought the film was an achievement. But yeah, more story would have really helped matters. And so, ratings for Baise-Moi from the year 2000. I'm going to be rating this movie a solid 5 out of 10. This was an interesting film, to say the least, and I feel that at times it lacked originality, as it kind of reminded me of a crossover between Death Wish and Ms. 45. Those two movies were much bigger productions that had a clear message for its audience. With Baise-Moi, it was kind of messy and a lot of focus on sex and violence, which only confused matters. Now, there's a lot of controversy around this movie, and some will say, is this the most controversial French film ever released? For me, no, it's not. I mean, this movie is decent enough and I recommend it, but there was a lot of smoke and mirrors going on here. There was a lot of hype and not as much substance. If you guys have seen the movie, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. If you have not seen this movie, as I said, I do recommend it, but be aware that this is a very harsh movie that, you probably won't want to rush back and watch it anytime soon. Anyways, that's all from me today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed the review. I'll be back next week with another cult movie review. Don't forget to subscribe, guys, and of course, take care. I'll see you next week.